we get started, please do feel welcome to chime in the chat. And I know and I'm grateful to see each of you, but pop in the chat your name, and if you're sort of thinking about and anticipating applying some tools to your workplace and your practice, feel welcome to share what kind of institution you're working in. And also, where are you calling from, or like, where are you joining from? Where are you located right now? I'm Sharon, as we know, and I'm excited to share with you all today a tool that I use in my work called the Success Framework that is helpful in processing racial dynamics and dynamics that engage in cross-cultural, cross-racial, and just diverse and ideally equitable opportunities. And so we will just spend the next bit of time together, whether it's over breakfast, lunch, wherever you are, to be able to explore that framework and offer how it can be helpful. So we'll just have a little bit of time for some brief introductions, and then I'll introduce you to my approach to the work that I've been doing and really offer how racial literacy as a set of skills and abilities has been really critical in helping to advance equity, inclusion, diversity, anti-racism within institutions, and then introduce and offer the success framework and ways that it can be applied. We'll have time to have any questions, answers, conversation while we're together, and then share some resources for how you can take next steps and move forward in this work. So to get started, I'll just open up the chat and check in on where folks are coming from. Also, quick intro and highlight to Sarah, who is a part of the SWC team and is going to help with the chat and just sort of moving us forward today, coming from Tampa. Aisha, you are still in Philly. That's great. My neighbor, 15 minutes. And doing some contracting work. That's awesome. And Murad, thank you for joining. Working at Yale. Okay, that's awesome. So you've had a move since I saw you last, I think, in California. Oh no, in New York, right? Okay, yes, it's New York. I've been bouncing around a while, so glad to see you here. Well, from the different places that we've connected and to still be able to be in touch now, I just will sort of reintroduce where I'm at and what I've been up to. So, I'm Sharon, and I am grateful to be leading Sharon Washington Consulting for these last 3 to 4 years, and also recently revamped my online learning platform, Critically Conscious Connections, where I provide learning resources and community for folks to deepen diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. My background is in health education, public health, particularly sexuality and health, and my bachelor's in African American Studies from Temple University has really helped to shape and frame my intersecting approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, with really grounding and centering this work in anti-racism and really operating out of the intersections of healthcare, health inequities, medical education, and really having a trauma-informed approach to improving and working towards eliminating health inequities throughout the various health and allied health professions. So welcome, Julie. Thank you for joining. So my approach to engaging institutions is really framed in a comprehensive strategy to working within institutions to cultivate meaningful, sustainable, and integrated change, healing, and ultimately transformation. And so especially coming out of 2020, many institutions were ready to take on all aspects of anti-racism, and rightfully so. The time has been, and the call was clear coming out of the pandemic. And at the same time, even having a strong strategic plan of best practices when implemented by folks who themselves interpersonally are not well equipped for maintaining change can actually be pretty harmful to the team members involved. So my process for engaging in action to create equity or peace efforts, as I frame them, really begin with preparing institutions for growth, which includes offering an organizational assessment to have a better sense of the inventory of activities and patterns around diversity, equity, and inclusion that are in place, as well as interviews with folks that I consider invested agents. And so those folks who are, by the virtue of their marginalized identities, their marginalized titles or roles or positions within the organization, are furthest away from decision makers and oftentimes most voiceless or invisible, oftentimes in institutional policies, practices, and norms. And so really grounding this approach and centering this approach and process for growth in the voices, perspectives, and interests of those who are most marginalized has been really important in this approach. So then with that background, then equipping leaders to be able to lead and sustain change has been an important and unique approach that I've utilized. So again, coming out of 2020 with the call to action nationally and globally being so clear and so salient, many institutions wanted to get everybody in the organization some kind of training, which is valid. And yet I find that when I offer an authentic and very connected training or dialogue with folks who are at the front lines of organizations and who are furthest removed from decision making, and where most organizational diversity does lie in those more entry-level positions, that to empower those folks and to equip those folks with knowledge and skills to promote equity, and then have the most senior leaders not either be engaged or not have the necessary skills to be able to maintain that momentum, is something that sets organizations up for harm and for failure. So really beginning from the early stages of an engagement, equipping leaders with racial literacy and foundational shared knowledge, skills, and collective trust, vulnerability, and transparency through racial literacy coaching. And so I will identify senior leaders who are committed to this effort and who have the agency to influence policies, practices, and norms, and really work to equip them to be able to help to lead the rest of these phases, contribute to, and hold space for their team members as we disseminate dialogue and change throughout an organization. So building on the phase of equipping leaders, we then start to penetrate further into the institution by implementing climate surveys to better understand the experiences and the needs across the entire organization, coupled with listening sessions to better understand the results of those surveys, safe and brave spaces that are caucused based on identities, roles and titles, lineage, and legacy within the organization, so that we can hear in protected and safer spaces what the needs are and how the organization is reacting to the rollout for change. And all of this building on a foundation of leaders who are equipped to show up into these very intimate dialogues, and first of all, not perpetuate harm, but also to be able to benefit from the opening up and the transparency and honesty of team members, hold that sacred offering, and be able to institutionalize change with that, with those gifts. We then will implement change in HR policies, practices, oftentimes integrate training and curriculum via my online learning platform, Critically Conscious Connections, that then does begin to reach across the organization. We're customizing trainings based on what we've understood from the organizational assessment and climate surveys. We're integrating leaders into debrief sessions and dialogues and processing spaces because they are equipped with the necessary skills in racial literacy to do so. And we then are able to grow into evaluating these processes, adjusting the curricula, further institutionalizing and leveraging dashboards to be able to institutionalize and further integrate these processes for change, metrics for growth and knowledge acquisition, and over time, connect those with organizational outcomes. So as I've mentioned, that sort of comprehensive approach really starting from those who are most invested and vulnerable, marginalized within this space, and building leaders' literacy and skills to be able to lead through the critical race and critical DEIA lens really is predicated on those leaders being able to have and develop racial literacy. Racial literacy can be defined through increased awareness of oneself, one's own racial identity and socialization, as well as one's surroundings, and being able to discern and understand and recognize the role of our racialized context, the differences that we have with others in a shared space, as well as the significance and the role of trauma that we bring into dynamics and that others may bring. Racial literacy also reflects or can be defined through our ability to reflect critically and consciously on our own development and experiences, as well as the racial issues that are taking place more broadly in our communities, in our institution, in our society, and in mixed group, cross-racial, cross-cultural settings, being able to convey clearly our reflections on what's happening. Racial literacy includes the skills to be able to communicate our racialized reality. And so being able to take action in our life, speaking up, articulating our position and experience, and applying all of that awareness, cognition, and communication skill throughout our personal life and within our professional life, and especially to interrupt racism when we see it. And to apply this healing element to the harms, the trauma, and especially from a healthcare perspective, that it really does become embodied in the minds, bodies, spirits of those who are most racialized and targeted with interpersonal and institutional harms. And so being able to apply healing strategies for coping with racial trauma and stress, and being able to lend a space and a resource to others doing the same. And so that's a lot of skill and practice, and then being able to apply that in various settings. And so I utilize the 6S framework to really help professionals and leaders and learners in healthcare settings to do the thing of sort of moving from knowing that we want to do that and really settle into the how to do that. And so I offer that by focusing on ourself, the space, the systems that are at play, solidarity, speaking up, and solutions. It provides us with the critical tools, sort of touch points, and stepping stones to ensure that we are pretty comprehensively and deeply reflecting on the various elements of our dynamics at play, as well as who's involved and all of the critical elements to be able to create aligned and accomplishing strategies for change and connection. And so I offer that this framework is most helpful for folks in building their racial literacy by applying it to situations as a source of reflection after you've experienced a dynamic, or when you anticipate going into a cross-racial, cross-cultural, or just new experience. It's something that you can use as a tool to really help build the skill sets that over time sort of become a lens that becomes hard to take off. You know, the more you practice sort of putting on this lens of thinking through dynamics in this way, it becomes sort of like putting on a way of thinking and processing. And over time, it's like a muscle that develops and you don't have to take it off. It just, you use it, you're thinking in that way and it's happening. But to use it as a tool to build those skills, I think it's helpful to sort of anticipate or to reflect with it. In anticipating dynamics that may arise, it can be very helpful to sort of use this tool before entering into a space or a process or dynamic, or even just a meeting with your diverse teams or clients. And so allowing it to be something that helps to ensure that you are thoroughly processing all that you can to be most aware and in tune with the ways in which diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism may be showing up in the dynamics. And again, it's helpful for individuals as well as for teams to be able to navigate organizational dynamics and make organizational strategy and plans for growth. I gave you just the highest touch points of what the 6 S's are, but sort of adding that to the background on racial literacy and what that is, and how racial literacy is a key component in my broader approach to organizational change. I want to just touch base real quick with you and see, how is this landing so far? Do you have any questions? I'll also give a quick hi to friends who just joined in the last few minutes. Any questions, thoughts? How is this sort of settling in for you? And I'll pull up the chat and see what you've offered so far. All right. General thumbs up. General question mark. We'll keep going, but
I'm sorry, I don't type fast enough, but I wanted to type a question. Could I just ask you?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. So I know you said that this was for like racism, but then at the end you added that even if you're just coming into a new space. So more recently I came into a new space. The group that I'm in, it's mainly women. And while this group is beneficial for me learning, in the past, I feel like I've always had challenges with being in a group of women and figuring out where I fit. And I feel like if I are these some of the skills that I would use in order to figure out like either what I'm doing wrong, or is it just okay to not have to fit?
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate that question. And I think that, you know, we are always experiencing all of the various dimensions of diversity that are wrapped up in who we are and who we bring to a given space. Our gender, our race, our nationality, our citizenship, our body type, our body's ability, our cognitive ability, all of these aspects of who we are always showing up as we show up and take up space, connect with people, collaborate, and experience conflict. And so my particular approach does maintain a very active sort of centering of the role of race in those intersecting forms of diversity and dynamics that are at play. And yet, I think that this framework and this tool can be helpful in sort of bringing to the forefront any type of the dimensions of diversity that are most salient and relevant to your situation. So in this, it sounds like in a gender homogenous space, you're all identifying as women, and in the past that has evoked difficulty, challenge, conflict, harm. I think that this, as even a healing tool, a grounding tool, and a tool for self-reflection, can definitely help you to explore what dynamics are showing up, what are you bringing into the dynamic, and how are others aligning in this space. So I'm going to guide us through some elements of what this framework evokes for us and how it guides you in through reflection, as well as some specific reflection questions that can help you. And I think as you maybe apply it to what that situation is that you're experiencing, it will be great to sort of check in on the other side of these next slides to see how you're leveraging those reflection questions in that setting in your mind, and see maybe what comes up for you. But I definitely think it's applicable. Any other thoughts, questions? How we're feeling about it so far? Okay. Well, thank you for that, Aisha. So to that point, let's explore how focusing on each of these 6 S's can really evoke self-reflection, interpersonal, institutional, and societal reflection that can really help us to bring our most critically conscious and intentional self into collaborative dynamics. So first, I encourage folks to click the right button, focus on the self. So, and that's oftentimes, especially for folks in helper fields, in medicine, in mental health, in hard bench sciences, where objectivity and, even entering into the field may oftentimes be driven by wanting to help others, which is very much like a separating the self from either the work or even the space. I've had physicians describe how in their training, they're told you sort of put your white coat on, and that like makes it not about you. It makes it about the patient. And so for many of us, we are primed, even in our desire to be of service to others, to not make it about us. And yet, how we show up can really compromise or really drive the success of cross-cultural communication, collaboration, and healing. And so I really encourage folks to start with a reflection on the self. That includes reflecting on our own socialization. When you think about your early childhood, the books that you read, the comments that you heard from your parents and guardians and grandparents about groups like yourselves or people who were different from you. When you think about driving past different neighborhoods and commentary that you heard, or when significant issues rose up in the news, how did the people closest to you talk about those things and socialize you into ideas about yourself and about others? Internalized racial oppression and how folks of dominant racial identities, white folks and folks that are white adjacent, white passing, experience being socialized into a worldview that frames your in-group as superior, as belonging, whereas those who are racial minorities experience being socialized into assumptions of inferiority and not belonging and exclusion and being targeted. And so really having a grasp or an active process of exploring how that internalized racial oppression has impacted us, all of us, including people of dominant and privileged identities. Really taking the time to be connected to the issue of the isms, each of them, whether that's sexism for people who are cisgendered males, for, issues of, physical disability for those who identify as able-bodied, that even if we have dominant identities, we do experience the oppressive nature of operating within social identities that are made into hierarchies and devalue and dehumanize others. We can reflect on microaggressions and those subtle slights and indignities that happen throughout our day, not only those that we experience and that are targeted towards us, but also those that we witness, that we interrupt and don't interrupt, as well as those that we perpetuate unintentionally and out of the status quo. Sometimes we're running race-based labs because that's what our institution does and accounts for the races of our patients when we know that that's not biologically or scientifically sound. Have an active reflection on our own fragility. And when we are operating out of our more dominant, more privileged identities, when might we be fragile to feedback, to being maybe numerically a minority in our privileged identities, and having the conversation not be about us and maybe being disruptive with that or uncomfortable in ways that are salient to this space and maybe interrupting the experiences of folks who might be more marginalized. Having a critical awareness of our intersecting identities, as well as the agency, the authority, the ability to influence change that we have in our families, our communities, and in our workplaces. That's a lot, and we're just getting started with the self. And so I also encourage folks to then, once you have an active sense of who you are and what you're bringing into dynamics, focus on the space. The focus on the space can mean the social space, the dynamic that we're creating when we're interpersonally interacting with one another, who is represented in this conversation, what types of identities, what kinds of marginalized perspectives might be happening in this space and in this dynamic. I also mean the physical space. Sometimes we're talking about harms or bias that's happening in a hospital setting or a setting of higher education. And when you walk down the hallways, the images that show who have been leaders, who have been thought partners here, who have been presidents and executives within this space, and they're all cis, hetero, white males that are older, right? And that's sending messages to people who don't identify in that way, when the physical space itself is signaling who is welcome, who is able to thrive here. When we see that the only language that's shown in any of the signage in an institution that's in a very multicultural, multilinguistic community is English, that is signaling important messages about the safety of the space, the inclusion of the space, and can influence the interpersonal dynamics that we experience. I want to invite folks to consider based on who's in this space, how are we centering the voices of those who are most marginalized? How are we bringing our identities and our fragility and our blind spots into the space and into the dynamic? How is just our presence and how we show up based on our socialization impacting the space and the dynamic? When we're focusing on who's present, we can identify who are invested agents, those that are most marginalized, those that are most invested in change and transformation and repair, and who are those change agents that are most equipped to cultivate change via policies, practices, and institutional norms. And sometimes people are intersecting, in their identities as both invested and change agents. And just being able to track who those folks are and prepared to engage with them is an important part of the process. As we've focused on who we are and then who is around us and observing and engaging with the space that we occupy and that we are sharing, then exploring the systems that are at play. What are the systems of inequity that are represented based on who and what identities are part of this dynamic? What are the institutional practices and patterns that might be at play in a given situation? And what might be driving conflict or challenge or collaboration and collegiality, and being able to have a conscious awareness of those systems, whether institutional, societal, and how we even bring our own internalized orientation to systems of inequity. So if I, as a person of color, am operating out of an internalized place of inferiority where I don't share my ideas in group settings, I don't step up for opportunities for leadership because I doubt that I'll get them because I haven't in the past for no justifiable reason. I may be maintaining and internalizing racial and gender-based socialized ideas of inferiority, and that's hindering the potential for inclusion and equity and transformation within the institution where I'm sharing my gifts. This also includes being able to align with how we, given our privilege and given our agency and roles and titles and positions of power and orientation towards power, even given our identities, how might we be perpetuating systemic harm through our behaviors? Being able to take responsibility and account for the types of practices and patterns that we as individuals may be contributing towards that might be harming others that we're trying to collaborate with. And then as we reflected on those systemic and pattern-based, socialized, sort of informed ways of perpetuating inequity and harm, we then can enter into creating solidarity that's meaningful and enriching. You know, many times leaders, professionals, folks with dominant and more privileged identities will want to jump into allyship because we care, because that's what we believe in. And yet without actually having the knowledge and the skills to know how to do so in an informed and culturally humble way, we can cause harm and we can overstep boundaries that folks who are marginalized are attempting to be able to curate in the workspace that allows them some agency and some autonomy in being able to bring their voice meaningfully to this kind of work and to this space. And so I want to then focus on solidarity. So really preparing ourselves to move from survival status of dealing with dynamics to really thriving by institutionalizing a commitment to change. And so that requires really knowing what the needs are of those who are most marginalized. And that's where those organizational assessments, a climate survey, listening sessions are so critical in being able to define our allyship and even more accomplishship around the genuine needs and asks and calls to action from those who are experiencing the most harm in our shared spaces. Being able to invest in and prepare for and understand what are community-driven solutions, what are the solutions that those who are most marginalized are really looking for, and preparing ourselves to not only work towards implementing and investing in those solutions, but also equipping those who are most marginalized to be prepared to lead those solutions and be central in the change itself. Once we have a sense of grounding in what solidarity looks like and entails, and we can operationalize that from the people who are most marginalized themselves, then speaking up, leveraging our agency, utilizing and leveraging our privileges, our voice, our positionality to not only invite and amplify the voices of those that are most marginalized, but also to echo and to advance their recommendations, their aims, and their leadership. That also includes challenging us to interrupt bias in real time. And that takes not only the knowledge and the ability to sort of recognize even microaggressions, those that are more subtle and more nuanced, but also the grounding skills to mitigate our own fragility, our own reactivity, the hot sensations that flow through the body or the clenching of parts of our body, and those somatic reactions that happen in our body that reflect our own tension, our own trauma, and can be barriers to showing up in allyship and solidarity with others. And applying what I call the ABCs of engaging in racial discourse and anti-racist work: always be curious, always be compassionate, always be centered, and always be coachable in that work. And so with the skills of applying our reflections and our communication to speaking up and amplifying those who are most marginalized, really then being able to cultivate meaningful solutions. So again, going back to that wild ride that was 2020, and how the call to action was so clear and just palatable across the country and around the world. And so the idea of jumping into solutions, I understood where that was coming from. And yet it's so critical to not do so unless we are grounded in the voices of those that are most marginalized, prepared to amplify the leadership of those who have experiential and expertise in a critically intersectional approach to cultivating sustainable change. And so being able to not only redistribute the ways in which voices are listened to within institutions, and power and agency to influence change can be affected by really centering those that are most marginalized and creating policies and practices that mitigate the kinds of harms that we've inherited in many of our institutions. And so some helpful reflection questions that can guide us through this process include, and Aisha and others may be thinking about specific dynamics that are involving diverse team members or impact diverse populations. We can start with reflecting on ourselves. And so based on my own identities, my titles, my roles within this situation, what's my positionality in the various hierarchies and power dynamics that are at play in this institution? Where am I in the various hierarchies based on my intersecting roles, titles, and identities? What triggers me in this situation? When do I feel fragile? When do I feel reactive and defensive? When am I being reminded of when I've been harmed in similar situations in the past? And how is that showing up in my body, in my behavior, in my affect and my attitude? And what experiences specifically have shaped those kinds of reactions so that I'm able to do some work to retrace the tracks of my trauma as it's showing up in this new dynamic, and really being able to increase my conscious awareness of how that might influence the way that I show up and how I'm perceived by others in this space. When I think about this space, what is the racial, gender-based, and other forms of diversity of dimension? What is the representation of diversity in this dynamic? And how might who is present influence this dynamic? And also, is the dynamic influenced by who is not present? Why are the people who are not present not present? And that in and of itself may be very insightful about sort of how power dynamics are showing up, how microaggressions are showing up, and macroaggressions and other forms of harms and bias are showing up in this space. Being able to question and explore the systems of inequity. What kinds of isms, what kinds of associations, assumptions, stereotypes, stigmatization is playing out in the dynamic that's here? Sometimes it's among a homogenous group of women. We still may be perpetuating sexism and transphobia and body, body judgment and exclusionary ideas and practices and norms, because there is a lack of diversity, even though we might all be women of color or women with low socioeconomic status, etc. So really looking critically at what kinds of dynamics of structural oppression are seeping into and showing up into the dynamic. What policies, practices, or norms are involved in this dynamic that might be perpetuating group inequities? And when we think about solidarity, who is most marginalized in this situation? Which intersecting identities are in this space and being negatively impacted? How can the needs, perspectives, and voices of those who are most marginalized be centered in this dynamic and brought to the forefront, listened to, and then allowed to lead, encouraged to lead, and supported in their leadership? How do we align those that are most marginalized with those opportunities for really taking center stage in our work? And then around speaking up, what would I say or do next in this situation? How can my voice best be utilized to amplify the voices and the needs of those that may be most marginalized? What is keeping me from speaking up? And sometimes doing the internal inquiry of what has held me back when I've had the opportunity and I didn't speak up. Where is their pain? Where is their trauma? And how might that even somatically be clenching me up so I miss the moment? And who would be key institutional change agents that can be aligned with and charged with accountability for helping advance these efforts and support opportunities for repair and for growth and change? What kinds of terms, concepts, language are pertinent? Do I need to further develop? What communities that operate in the margins of society have vernacular that I should know to help me better be able to reach them, connect with them, and understand their experiences and needs? And then solutions. Again, what immediate action can be done for people who have been targeted and harmed, to reach people who have perpetuated harm, to gain the buy-in and collaboration of those who influence policies and practices that are impacting this situation? And what are best practices in the field that have not necessarily been integrated into this institution that could help influence and mitigate the kinds of harms that maybe are playing out at any given time? So that's just some questions that are able to help guide us through these 6 S's that, in a process of reflection, that then leads to a healthy preparedness to align with those who are most marginalized and carrying harms within our institution in solidarity, leveraging and preparing and equipping us to speak up and amplify those marginalized voices and create sustainable, community-driven solutions that can be institutionalized, that then we cycle back into ensuring that as we're contributing towards solutions and those solutions are unfolding, that then we're reflecting back on ourselves and how am I showing up in this solution? How am I showing up in the rollout of the implementation of a new policy? Now that we are reporting bias in a new way, or we are integrating new curriculum and assessments and accountability, how am I, experiencing, showing up, contributing to, and impacting the dynamics of the next iteration of our culture as it begins to shift, and so on and so forth. And so it's quite cyclical. It's not linear. And it's something that at each stage of reflection, all other aspects are still at play, and yet it gives us I think, a paced way to ensure that we're touching the key and foundational touch points of strategy that allow us to ensure that when we are actually implementing solutions, that we've really ensured that, as equitable as we can be, we've really explored being authentic and being aligned in those processes. So for those of you who have joined today, in thanks, I'm going to send you a follow-up email with a link to a critically conscious connection space that's housing all of the webinar content. So you'll get this recording, and I'll also provide you with a case scenario that offers a situation that could be relatable and could be transferable to various workplaces, and invites you to utilize reflection questions from the 6S framework to process what you might do, and be able to potentially take that reflection and apply it in your workplace if you find that a similar scenario could really take place or has taken place. So for you all joining, that will be something that you'll be able to access. And it's based in a healthcare scenario, but if you are in a different field, feel free to make it work for you, because it is a scenario that is commonplace among people and spaces and not specific to any clinical situation. So I've given you a lot. I'm going to just check in on the chat, see if folks want to chime in and offer any questions or points of clarification. How is this landing for folks? Any questions at this time?
Me again.
Hey.
Hi. So I like how you went into self and how you show up, because it gave me another a perspective, because sometimes I think I just show up as an African-American woman. I don't realize that I show up as under 35 or single or with a child, not married, or all those other spaces. So that really opened that, wow, maybe it's not what I was thinking. Maybe it's something. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Let me check the chat. Any other thoughts, questions so far? All right, friends. Well, that process of increasing your critical consciousness of all of the various layers of who we are and what we bring into a diverse dynamic of others who themselves are layers of complexity and socialization and stereotypes and ideas that we've been socialized through media and formal and informal education and exposure to institutions, that it is a constant practice of reflection and critical self-development to be able to develop the tools of racial literacy that we can utilize internally as well as interpersonally and apply to the institutions where we have the agency to influence policies, practices, norms, but even just how we deliver the services and the skills that we bring as team members, let alone as leaders in the various settings that we engage. And so to provide tools and ongoing support and strategies, exercises to help folks engage in this increasingly deepening reflection of the self, but also of others and our shared history and how all of that shows up in our institutions and our interpersonal dynamics, how we embody all of that, and how that embodiment influences how we're able to contribute to change. I've offered and curated courses and course bundles and micro learnings in the online learning platform Critically Conscious Connections that I've mentioned. And so I really want to encourage folks to check out this course bundle of tools for critical conversations that has such a variety of resources for increasing our self-reflection, our tools and preparedness to ground ourselves as we navigate complex and challenging and diverse dynamics, as well as tools for having language and context for being able to maximize the opportunity to leverage diversity, promote inclusion, and really create opportunities for equity and anti-racism. And so with our last minutes, I invite you to share any ways that you think this kind of resource might be helpful in your current workplaces or with your teams, or how you might apply this. But for those of you who have joined today, the cost of the courses for themselves individually is $1,400, but just to bundle that as a package, the price we've brought down to $1,099. But for you all taking the time today to join and to really be a part of being able to introduce these tools incrementally in these webinars, I've offered you a 20% off discount for this course or for this course bundle that you'll be able to access by using this coupon code if you go to the website. And so, like I said, I will send you an email so that you can access this recording afterwards, especially for those who trickled in a little later. And then you'll also be able to utilize this coupon code and get a discount on this bundle of resources that really can help to expand that self-reflection, utilize the success framework and other frameworks and tools like the ABCs to really move you further into how you're showing up as a diverse and complex contributor to our diverse teams that really are calling for equity, anti-racism, transparency, healing, and repair. And I know and believe that each of us is capable of really contributing to that. So I'll pause for any last questions, thoughts, suggestions. Oh, thanks, guys, in the chat. Hey, Murad. Yeah.
I was just curious if I were to go to leadership in our organization and sort of like want to think about a referral or want to think about how we can sort of, how can they can potentially take advantage of your services, what is the best way to do that? Is it that I would sort of have them contact you and set up a consultation, or what would that look like, and what information could I give them in that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So all of these courses can be customized and tailored for institutions. So especially using that organizational assessment and interviews, I can curate course content that really helps to address the unique needs and challenges that are happening within each institution. And so you can go to Critically Conscious Connections, and there are tabs that invite folks to engage leadership or engage in organizational change. And I would just, a form will come up. You can populate it with some information. You might provide the link to that page to the leaders, and they might want to fill that in. But either way, it will ultimately lead to a consultation call where I could better understand what the opportunities for growth are. And then we can, customize a pathway forward for the institution and its leaders. Yeah, thanks, Fran. Other thoughts, questions, ideas for how you might utilize the success framework, or any dynamics that are already sort of simmering and being processed in a new way? Let me just check the chat. Awesome. Thanks, Murad. Wonderful, Heather. All right then, friends, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming and connecting in this space, and for allowing me to share the tools and the approach that are really special to me and have been really impactful in this work. So look forward to an email that's going to invite you to enroll so that you can access the webinar, you can access the digital download of the case scenario, and explore the courses and the bundles that are available on Critically Conscious Connections. All right, friends, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.